My name is Father Thomas McCarthy, and I'm 73 years old. For 42 years, I wore the collar with pride, believing I was serving God's highest calling. I stood at countless altars, delivered thousands of homilies, and heard confessions that would make your blood run cold. But today, I'm not speaking to you as a priest. I'm speaking as a broken man who discovered that sometimes the very institution you've devoted your life to can become the source of your greatest shame. I was ordained in 1978, fresh out of seminary, with stars in my eyes and fire in my heart. Back then, the Catholic Church felt like an unshakable fortress of faith, and I was honored to be one of its soldiers. My first assignment was to St. Catherine's Parish in a small town called Millbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Massachusetts. The church was a beautiful stone building that had stood for over a century, its steeple reaching toward heaven like a finger pointing the way home. Father Michael Brennan, the pastor, was a man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the world. He welcomed me with open arms and promised to teach me everything I needed to know about shepherding God's flock. Those first years were magical, I won't lie to you. I threw myself into every aspect of parish life with the enthusiasm of youth. I organized youth groups, visited the sick and elderly, performed marriages and baptisms, and felt the profound satisfaction of making a real difference in people's lives. The parishioners embraced me as their own son, inviting me to family dinners and holiday celebrations. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an elderly widow who lived alone, would bring me homemade apple pies every Sunday after Mass. The Morrison family, who had 5 children ranging from toddlers to teenagers, treated me like an uncle. Young couples would seek my counsel for their marriages, parents would ask for guidance with rebellious teenagers, and the elderly would confide their deepest fears about death and what lay beyond. I genuinely believed I was living a life of purpose and meaning. During those early years, I felt closer to God than I ever had before or since. When I celebrated Mass, I could feel the sacred presence filling the sanctuary. When I prayed, I felt like I was having real conversations with the divine. When I comforted the grieving or counseled the troubled, I felt like I was truly being used as an instrument of God's love and mercy. It was everything I had dreamed of when I first felt called to the priesthood as a young boy growing up in Boston. Father Brennan became more than just my supervisor. He became a father figure and mentor. He taught me the delicate art of pastoral care, showing me how to balance compassion with wisdom, how to listen without judgment, and how to offer hope without making empty promises. He had a way of making everyone feel heard and valued, from the wealthiest businessman to the poorest migrant worker. Under his guidance, I learned to see each person who walked through our doors as a beloved child of God, regardless of their circumstances or struggles. But even in those golden early years, there were shadows that I was too naive or too trusting to recognize. Father Brennan would sometimes receive phone calls that would leave him visibly shaken, though he never shared the details with me. Occasionally, men in expensive suits would visit the rectory for private meetings that lasted for hours behind closed doors. When I asked about these visits, Father Brennan would simply say they were diocesan business and change the subject. I assumed it was just the mundane administrative work that came with running a parish, the kind of boring bureaucratic details that the seminary had never prepared us for. There were other small things that didn't quite make sense, but that I dismissed at the time. Sometimes families would suddenly stop coming to Mass without explanation, leaving me to wonder what had happened to drive them away. Other times, I would notice that certain priests from neighboring parishes seemed to move around frequently, always being reassigned to new locations just when they appeared to be settling in. When I mentioned these observations to Father Brennan, he would remind me that the Church's ways were mysterious and that it wasn't our place to question the decisions of our superiors. He taught me that obedience was one of the highest virtues a priest could possess, and that questioning authority was a sign of pride and spiritual immaturity. Looking back now, I can see how systematically I was being trained to not ask questions, to not dig too deeply, to accept whatever explanations I was given without further investigation. It was a slow, subtle process of conditioning that happened over months and years. Each time I expressed curiosity about something that seemed unusual, I was gently but firmly redirected. Each time I suggested that we might handle a situation differently, I was reminded of the importance of following established protocols. Each time I wondered if there might be a better way to address a problem, I was told that the Church's wisdom came from centuries of experience and that my role was to trust and obey, not to innovate or question. The transformation was so gradual that I didn't even realize it was happening. Slowly but surely, I learned to stop asking questions. I learned to accept that there were things beyond my understanding or authority. I learned to trust that my superiors always had good reasons for their decisions, even when those reasons weren't explained to me. I learned to see doubt and curiosity as spiritual weaknesses to be overcome rather than natural human instincts to be trusted. By my 5th year at St. Catherine's, I had become exactly the kind of priest the system wanted: obedient, unquestioning, loyal to the institution above all else. I had learned to see the Church not just as a collection of believers seeking truth, but as an organization that needed to be protected at all costs. I had absorbed the belief that anything that might damage the Church's reputation was inherently evil, regardless of whether it was true or false. I had come to understand that my highest duty was not to seek justice or truth, but to preserve the institution that had given my life meaning and purpose. This mindset served me well as I advanced in my career. In 1985, I was promoted to pastor of my own parish, St. Margaret's, in the larger town of Riverside. The diocesan officials praised my discretion, my loyalty, and my ability to handle sensitive situations without creating unnecessary complications. They told me I had a bright future in the church hierarchy if I continued to demonstrate the same wisdom and restraint that had marked my early years. I was proud of their confidence in me and determined to live up to their expectations. St. Margaret's was a much larger and more complex parish than St. Catherine's had been. We had over 2,000 registered families, 3 weekend masses, a parish school with 400 students, and dozens of ministries and organizations. The administrative responsibilities were overwhelming at first, but I threw myself into the work with the same enthusiasm I had always shown. I hired competent staff, delegated responsibilities effectively, and worked to build relationships with the key families and community leaders who could help support our various programs and initiatives. The responsibilities at St. Margaret's were far more complex than anything I had experienced at St. Catherine's. Along with the increased administrative duties came what the diocese called special pastoral situations that required careful handling. These were cases that couldn't be managed through normal channels, situations that demanded what my superiors termed pastoral discretion and institutional wisdom. I was told that these matters were tests of my maturity as a priest and my commitment to the greater good of the Church. The first such case arrived on my desk in the winter of 1987. A mother named Patricia Kellerman came to see me, visibly distressed and struggling to find the words to explain why she was there. Her son David, who was 12 years old at the time, had been serving as an altar boy for Father Vincent Russo, one of my associate priests. Mrs. Kellerman explained that David had been acting strangely for several weeks, having nightmares, refusing to serve at Mass, and becoming withdrawn and fearful. When she finally pressed him for an explanation, David broke down and told her that Father Russo had been touching him inappropriately during their private preparation sessions in the sacristy. I remember the moment she finished speaking as clearly as if it were yesterday. The room seemed to spin around me, and I felt like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. This was not the kind of situation they had prepared us for in seminary. I had dealt with alcoholic priests struggling with loneliness and depression, even priests who had violated their vow of celibacy with adult women. But this was different. This involved a child, an innocent boy who had trusted us with his safety and spiritual formation. My first instinct was to call the police immediately. Every fiber of my being as a human being screamed that this was a crime that needed to be reported to the proper authorities. But as I reached for the phone, I remembered the training I had received about handling sensitive situations. I had been taught that the church had its own procedures for dealing with such matters, procedures that had been developed over centuries to ensure that justice was served while protecting the institution from scandal and false accusations. Instead of calling the police, I called Monsignor William Hartley, the Vicar General of our diocese. Monsignor Hartley was a man in his early 60s who had built his reputation on his ability to handle delicate situations with discretion and effectiveness. He had been dealing with problem priests for decades and was considered one of the most skilled canon lawyers in the region. When I explained the situation to him, his response was immediate and authoritative. He told me to tell Mrs. Kellerman that the church would handle the matter internally, that Father Russo would be removed from ministry immediately pending a full investigation, and that she should not discuss the matter with anyone else while the investigation was ongoing. Monsignor Hartley arrived at St. Margaret's the next morning with two other diocesan officials I had never met before. They spent several hours in private meetings with Father Russo, emerging with grim expressions and briefcases full of documents. Father Russo was gone by evening, transferred to what they called a treatment facility for priests struggling with various personal issues. The official explanation given to the parish was that Father Russo had suffered a nervous breakdown and needed extended medical leave to recover his health. Mrs. Kellerman was invited to a meeting with Monsignor Hartley and the diocesan attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Mr. Donovan, who spoke in the careful language of legal contracts and liability mitigation. They explained to her that the church took such allegations very seriously and was committed to ensuring that her son received all the care and support he needed. They offered to pay for counseling sessions with a therapist of the church's choosing, someone who understood the sensitive nature of such situations and could be trusted to maintain confidentiality. They also presented her with an agreement that would provide financial compensation for David's suffering, while ensuring that the matter remained private to protect both her son's reputation and the church's ability to minister effectively to the community. I watched this process unfold with a mixture of relief and unease. On one hand, I was grateful that the situation was being handled by people with far more experience and expertise than I possessed. The church's response seemed swift and comprehensive, addressing both the immediate need to protect other children and the long-term need to help David heal from his trauma. On the other hand, something about the emphasis on confidentiality and reputation management troubled me in ways I couldn't quite articulate at the time. Mrs. Kellerman signed the agreement, and David began seeing the church-approved therapist twice a week. Father Russo disappeared from our lives as completely as if he had never existed. The parish continued to function normally, and most parishioners never knew that anything unusual had happened. The official story was that we had simply received a new assignment of priests to help with our growing congregation, and life went on as it always had. But for me, something fundamental had changed. I found myself paying closer attention to the interactions between priests and children, watching for signs that might indicate inappropriate behavior. I became more involved in the day-to-day operations of our youth programs, making sure that adults were never alone with children without proper supervision. I also began to notice patterns in the way the diocese handled other sensitive situations that came to my attention over the following months and years. There was Father James McKenna, who was quietly transferred from his parish after allegations of financial impropriety involving church funds. There was Father Paul Rodriguez, who disappeared overnight after a confrontation with angry parents about his drinking problem and erratic behavior around their teenagers. There was Father Daniel O'Brien, who was sent for spiritual renewal after what the diocese described as boundary issues with female parishioners. In each case, the process was the same: swift removal, official explanations that protected the church's reputation, and legal agreements that ensured the silence of anyone who might cause problems. I began to understand that I was part of a vast system designed not primarily to seek truth or justice, but to protect the institution at all costs. The church had developed sophisticated mechanisms for dealing with problematic priests that prioritized damage control over accountability. We had canon lawyers, public relations specialists, treatment facilities, and financial resources all dedicated to managing scandals before they could become public knowledge. It was an impressive operation in its efficiency and thoroughness, but it left me with growing questions about whether we were truly serving God's will or merely protecting our own interests. The most disturbing realization was how easily I had been drawn into this system without even realizing it was happening. I had been trained to see institutional loyalty as a virtue, to trust my superior's judgment even when it conflicted with my own instincts, and to believe that the church's survival was more important than any individual case of injustice. I had learned to rationalize decisions that felt wrong by telling myself that I didn't have all the information, that my superiors understood the bigger picture, and that my role was to obey rather than to question. Before I continue sharing more of this difficult journey with you, I want to pause for a moment to connect with those of you who are listening to my story. I know this isn't easy to hear, and I imagine some of you might be feeling the same confusion and discomfort that I felt during those years. If you're finding value in this honest conversation, I would be deeply grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe to this channel. But more than that, I want you to know that your presence here means everything to me. Sharing these memories requires me to relive some of the most painful moments of my life, but knowing that someone out there is willing to listen makes it worthwhile. Please leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from, or if any part of this story resonates with your own experiences. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is simply acknowledge that we're not alone in our struggles. Your stories matter just as much as mine, and I would be honored to hear them. As the years passed at St. Margaret's, I became increasingly skilled at what the diocese called crisis management. Each new case that crossed my desk was handled with the same methodical precision that had become second nature to me. I had learned the language of institutional protection so well that I could navigate even the most explosive situations without causing ripples that might reach beyond our carefully controlled circle. What I didn't realize was how this process was slowly eroding something fundamental within my own soul, something that had once been the very foundation of my calling to serve God. The turning point came in the spring of 1994, 16 years into my tenure at St. Margaret's. I'd just finished celebrating the Easter Vigil, one of the most beautiful and meaningful liturgies of the entire church year. The sanctuary was filled with the warm glow of candlelight, and the faces of the newly baptized adults radiated the joy of their fresh start in faith. As I was removing my vestments in the sacristy, my assistant, Sister Mary Catherine, knocked on the door with an urgency that immediately put me on alert. She told me that a young woman named Jennifer Walsh was waiting in my office and needed to speak with me about something extremely important. Jennifer was 26 years old, an elementary school teacher who had grown up in our parish and had recently returned to the area after completing her education. She was the daughter of Bob and Margaret Walsh, longtime parishioners whom I had known for years. Bob served on our finance committee, and Margaret was active in the Women's Auxiliary. They were the kind of solid, dependable Catholic family that formed the backbone of any parish community. When Jennifer walked into my office that evening, I could immediately see that she was struggling with something that had shaken her to her core. She sat down across from my desk, her hands trembling as she tried to find the words to begin. Finally, she looked me directly in the eyes and said something that sent shockwaves through my entire understanding of my own parish and my own role as its pastor. She told me that Father Anthony Carlucci, who had served as my associate pastor for the past 5 years, had been systematically abusing altar boys during overnight retreats and camping trips. But this wasn't just a recent discovery for Jennifer. She explained that she had known about Father Carlucci's behavior for over a decade, ever since she was a teenager, working as a volunteer youth minister in our parish. As Jennifer continued to speak, the full scope of what she was telling me began to sink in. She described how Father Carlucci had been preying on vulnerable boys for years, using his position of authority and the trust that families placed in the church to gain access to his victims. She told me about specific incidents that had occurred during parish events that I had personally organized and supervised. She described conversations she had witnessed, inappropriate physical contact she had observed, and the systematic way that Father Carlucci had isolated and manipulated the boys under his care. But the most devastating part of Jennifer's revelation was not what Father Carlucci had done, but what the parish community had failed to do in response. She explained that several parents had raised concerns about Father Carlucci's behavior over the years, but that these concerns had been dismissed or minimized by church leadership. Some families had quietly stopped allowing their sons to participate in youth activities, but they had never made formal complaints because they feared they wouldn't be believed or that they would be blamed for making false accusations against a priest. Jennifer herself had tried to raise concerns when she was younger, but she had been told by older volunteers that she was being overly suspicious and that she needed to be more trusting of God's anointed servants. When she had mentioned her observations to her parents, they had dismissed her worries as the overactive imagination of a teenage girl who had been influenced by negative media coverage of the church. Even when she had attempted to speak with me directly about her concerns several years earlier, I had apparently been so focused on defending Father Carlucci's reputation that I had failed to truly hear what she was trying to tell me. As Jennifer spoke, fragments of memory began to resurface in my mind, like pieces of a puzzle that I had been unconsciously avoiding. I remembered conversations with parents who had seemed unusually concerned about their sons' involvement in parish activities. I recalled instances when Father Carlucci had been defensive or evasive when I had asked him about certain aspects of his ministry with young people. I thought about the subtle changes in behavior I had observed in some of the altar boys over the years, changes that I had attributed to normal adolescent development or family problems rather than considering more sinister explanations. Most painfully, I began to realize that my own training in institutional protection had made me complicit in Father Carlucci's crimes. I had been so conditioned to assume the best about my fellow priests, to deflect criticism of church personnel, and to prioritize the reputation of the institution over all other considerations, that I had become blind to clear warning signs that should have prompted immediate investigation and action. My loyalty to the system had prevented me from protecting the very children that I had sworn to shepherd and guard. The weight of this realization was crushing. As Jennifer finished sharing her story, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what I had just learned. Here was a young woman who had grown up in our parish, who had dedicated years of her life to serving our community as a volunteer, who had tried repeatedly to protect other children from harm, and who had been failed not just by Father Carlucci, but by the entire system that was supposed to keep children safe. She had come to me not seeking revenge or financial compensation, but simply hoping that I would finally listen and take action to prevent other children from being victimized. I promised Jennifer that I would investigate her allegations immediately and thoroughly. I assured her that if what she was telling me was true, Father Carlucci would be removed from ministry permanently and that law enforcement would be contacted regardless of any diocesan policies about internal handling of such matters. I could see the relief in her eyes when I said this, mixed with a wariness that suggested she had heard similar promises before that had ultimately led nowhere. That night I couldn't sleep. I paced around the rectory for hours, praying desperately for guidance and wisdom. I knew that this situation was different from the previous cases I had handled. This wasn't just about one isolated incident or a single victim. This was about a systematic pattern of abuse that had been allowed to continue for years because people like me had been more concerned with protecting the institution than with protecting children. This was about my own failure to see what was happening right under my nose and my own complicity in creating an environment where such abuse could flourish unchecked. The next morning, I called Monsignor Hartley and requested an emergency meeting. When I arrived at the diocesan offices, I was ushered into the same conference room where I had participated in so many previous discussions about sensitive situations. But this time, I was determined that the outcome would be different. I presented Jennifer's allegations in detail, emphasizing both the seriousness of the accusations and the credibility of the source. I explained that multiple families had apparently had concerns about Father Carlucci over the years, and that there was likely a significant number of victims who had never come forward. Monsignor Hartley listened to my report with the same calm professionalism that he had displayed in all our previous interactions. When I finished speaking, he thanked me for bringing the matter to his attention and assured me that it would be investigated thoroughly. He told me that Father Carlucci would be placed on administrative leave immediately pending the outcome of the investigation, and that I should inform the parish that he was taking a temporary leave of absence for personal reasons. But then Monsignor Hartley said something that revealed the true nature of the system I had been serving for so many years. He reminded me that allegations of this type were often based on misunderstandings or exaggerations, especially when they came from individuals who might have personal grievances against the Church. He suggested that Jennifer might be motivated by factors other than genuine concern for children's welfare, and that her credibility would need to be carefully evaluated before any dramatic action was taken. He emphasized the importance of maintaining confidentiality during the investigation process to protect both Father Carlucci's reputation and the stability of the parish community. Most significantly, Monsignor Hartley made it clear that contacting law enforcement would be premature and potentially damaging to everyone involved. He explained that the Church had its own procedures for investigating such matters, procedures that were designed to ensure that the truth was discovered while protecting innocent people from false accusations. He reminded me that canon law required a thorough internal investigation before any external authorities could be involved, and that rushing to judgment could result in serious injustices for all concerned. As I listened to Monsignor Hartley's response, I felt something break inside me. I realized that despite all my hopes and promises to Jennifer, the system was going to handle this case exactly the same way it had handled all the others. Father Carlucci would be quietly transferred to another assignment or sent for treatment at a residential facility. Jennifer would be pressured to remain silent about her allegations to protect the Church's reputation. The families who had been affected would be offered counseling and financial settlements in exchange for confidentiality agreements, and the whole matter would disappear as if it had never happened, leaving Father Carlucci free to potentially victimize children in his next assignment. For the first time in my priesthood, I found myself facing a choice between institutional loyalty and moral conscience. Everything in my training and experience told me to trust the system, to follow established procedures, and to leave the difficult decisions to people with more authority and expertise than I possessed. But something deeper, something that connected to the very reason I had become a priest in the first place, was telling me that this was wrong, that protecting children was more important than protecting the institution, and that remaining silent in the face of such evil would make me complicit in whatever harm came next. The days following my meeting with Monsignor Hartley were among the most agonizing of my entire life. I found myself caught in a spiritual and moral crisis that tested everything I had believed about my vocation, my faith, and my understanding of right and wrong. On one side was the institutional church that had shaped my entire adult identity, provided me with purpose and meaning, and taught me to see obedience as the highest virtue. On the other side was my growing conviction that protecting children from predators was a moral imperative that transcended any loyalty to human institutions, no matter how sacred they claimed to be. I began to research canon law and diocesan policies with an intensity I had never applied to anything before. What I discovered horrified me. The Church had developed an elaborate system of internal procedures that effectively insulated accused priests from civil and criminal consequences while maintaining the appearance of taking allegations seriously. These procedures were designed to drag investigations out for months or years, during which time evidence could disappear, witnesses could be intimidated or discredited, and public attention could be diverted to other matters. The ultimate goal was not to discover truth or achieve justice, but to protect the institution's reputation and financial assets from the consequences of acknowledging wrongdoing. I also began to investigate Father Carlucci's background more thoroughly than I had ever done before. What I found chilled me to the bone. His previous assignments had all been relatively brief, typically lasting only 2 or 3 years before he was transferred to a new location. When I contacted priests from his former parishes, I heard variations of the same troubling story repeated over and over again. There had been complaints, rumors, and concerns about his behavior with young people, but these had always been handled quietly through transfers and reassignments rather than through formal investigations or disciplinary action. The pattern was unmistakable. Father Carlucci was what the diocese privately called a problem priest, someone whose behavior was known to be inappropriate or dangerous, but who was protected by the system as long as he didn't cause too much public embarrassment. He had been moved from parish to parish like a shell in a confidence game, always staying one step ahead of serious consequences while leaving a trail of damaged children and traumatized families in his wake. I realized that by accepting him as my associate pastor without asking the right questions, I had become complicit in this system of institutional protection for predators. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. As I dug deeper into Father Carlucci's history, I learned that Jennifer Walsh was not the only person who had tried to warn me about his behavior. Over the years, several parents had approached me with concerns about their children's interactions with Father Carlucci, but I had dismissed their worries as overprotectiveness or misunderstanding. I had been so invested in defending the reputation of my associate pastor and maintaining harmony within the parish that I had failed to recognize the warning signs that were right in front of me. Mrs. Sandra Phillips had tried to tell me that her son Michael seemed frightened of Father Carlucci and didn't want to serve as an altar boy anymore. I had reassured her that it was normal for boys to go through phases of reluctance about church activities and had encouraged her to be patient and supportive. Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez had expressed concerns about Father Carlucci's practice of taking altar boys on overnight camping trips without other adult supervision. I had defended these trips as valuable opportunities for spiritual formation and had suggested that their concerns reflected an unfortunate suspicion of priestly ministry that was becoming too common in modern society. Most painfully, 14-year-old Timothy O'Connor had tried to confide in me about something that Father Carlucci had done to him during a youth retreat, but I had been so uncomfortable with the implications of what he was suggesting that I had redirected the conversation toward general discussions of purity and the importance of not letting impure thoughts interfere with his spiritual development. Timothy had left my office that day looking defeated and ashamed, and he had never approached me again about anything personal. Within a few months, he had stopped participating in church activities altogether, and his family had eventually left the parish without explanation. As these memories flooded back to me, I realized that my failure to protect the children in my care was not just a matter of institutional loyalty overriding moral judgment. It was also a matter of psychological denial and willful blindness. I had been so invested in maintaining my image of Father Carlucci as a dedicated priest and my image of St. Margaret's as a safe and holy place that I had unconsciously filtered out any information that threatened these comfortable illusions. I had trained myself not to see what I didn't want to see, not to hear what I didn't want to hear, and not to acknowledge what I didn't want to acknowledge. The weight of this self-knowledge was almost unbearable. I had entered the priesthood, believing that I was called to be a shepherd who would lay down his life for his sheep, but I had become a hireling who ran away when the wolves appeared. I had promised God that I would use my authority to protect the vulnerable and defend the innocent. But I had used that same authority to shield predators and silence victims. I had taken vows of service and sacrifice, but I had served my own comfort and sacrificed the safety of children to preserve my peace of mind. For several weeks, I struggled with the question of what to do next. The easy path was to follow Monsignor Hartley's guidance, trust the diocesan investigation process, and hope that somehow justice would be served through internal channels. This would allow me to maintain my position, preserve my relationships with church authorities, and avoid the career-ending consequences that would inevitably follow any decision to break ranks with institutional policy. I could tell myself that I was being prudent and obedient, and that greater good would ultimately be served by working within the system rather than challenging it from outside. But the difficult path was becoming clearer to me with each passing day. Jennifer Walsh deserved more than empty promises and bureaucratic procedures. The children who had been victimized by Father Carlucci deserved to have their suffering acknowledged and their perpetrator held accountable. The families who had tried to warn me about dangerous behavior deserved to know that their concerns had been heard and taken seriously. Most importantly, the children who might become Father Carlucci's future victims deserved to be protected from harm, even if that protection came at the cost of institutional embarrassment and personal consequences for me. I began to pray with an intensity and desperation that I had not experienced since my earliest days in seminary. I begged God for guidance, for courage, for wisdom, and for forgiveness. I asked him to show me clearly what he wanted me to do, and to give me the strength to do it, regardless of the personal cost. I spent hours reading scripture, searching for passages that might illuminate the path forward. I found myself drawn again and again to the words of Jesus about the importance of protecting children and the severe consequences that awaited those who caused them to stumble. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Father Michael Brennan, my old mentor from St. Catherine's Parish. Father Brennan was now in his 80s and had retired from active ministry, but he remained one of the wisest and most spiritually mature priests I had ever known. When I called to ask if I could visit him to discuss a difficult pastoral situation, he immediately agreed to see me. I drove the 2 hours to his retirement community with a heavy heart, unsure of what I hoped to hear from him, but desperate for the perspective of someone I trusted and respected. When I arrived at Father Brennan's modest apartment, I was struck by how frail he had become since our last meeting several years earlier, but his eyes still held the same kindness and wisdom that had guided me through my early years in ministry. As we sat together in his small living room, surrounded by books and mementos from his decades of service, I poured out the entire story of Father Carlucci, Jennifer Walsh, and my own moral crisis. I told him about the pressure I was receiving from diocesan authorities to handle the matter quietly, and about my growing conviction that such an approach was fundamentally wrong. Father Brennan listened to my story without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question, but mostly just absorbing the full scope of what I was telling him. When I finished speaking, he was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the small garden that he tended as a hobby in his retirement. Finally, he turned back to me and spoke words that changed the trajectory of my life forever. He said, "Thomas, in all my years as a priest, I have learned that there are times when obedience to God requires disobedience to men, even when those men wear the same collar that we do. The church is not God, and protecting the church is not the same thing as serving God. Sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is to risk everything we hold dear in order to do what we know is right." Father Brennan went on to share with me some of his own experiences with institutional pressure to cover up wrongdoing, including cases from earlier decades that had never become public knowledge. He told me about the sleepless nights he had endured after following orders to remain silent about things that should have been reported to authorities. He described the spiritual damage that such compromises had inflicted on his own soul, and the regret he carried about victims who might have been protected if he had found the courage to speak out sooner. "The hardest lesson I learned," Father Brennan continued, "is that our first loyalty must always be to God and to the vulnerable people He has placed in our care. When those loyalties conflict with institutional interests, we must choose God every time, even if it costs us everything else. The Church will survive our disobedience, but our souls may not survive our silence." As I drove back to St. Margaret's that evening, I knew what I had to do. The path forward was terrifying and would almost certainly destroy the career and life I had built over the past 4 decades. But it was the only path that offered any hope of spiritual integrity or moral redemption. I would contact law enforcement directly, provide them with everything I knew about Father Carlucci's crimes, and accept whatever consequences followed from that decision. I would break my silence about the diocesan cover-up, even if it meant losing my position and facing legal action from church authorities. Most importantly, I would finally begin to fulfill the vows I had made so many years earlier to protect the vulnerable and defend the innocent, regardless of the personal cost. The morning I decided to contact the police was October 15th, 1994. I remember the date so clearly because it marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. I had spent the entire night in prayer, asking God for the final confirmation that I was making the right choice. As dawn broke over St. Margaret's, I felt a peace that I hadn't experienced in months, mixed with a terror about what lay ahead. I knew that once I made that phone call, there would be no going back to the comfortable life I had known for so many years. Detective Sarah Martinez of the Massachusetts State Police was the officer who took my initial call. When I identified myself as Father Thomas McCarthy and explained that I needed to report allegations of child sexual abuse involving a priest in my parish, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Detective Martinez later told me that she had been investigating crimes against children for over 15 years, but she had never received a call from a Catholic priest voluntarily reporting abuse by another priest. The institutional wall of silence around such cases was so well established that law enforcement agencies had learned not to expect cooperation from church officials. Within 2 hours, Detective Martinez and her partner were sitting in my office at St. Margaret's, taking detailed statements about everything I knew regarding Father Carlucci's crimes. They were professional but clearly skeptical, having been burned too many times by church officials who promised cooperation but then disappeared behind lawyers and canonical procedures. When I handed them copies of diocesan documents that I had photocopied from my files, including correspondence about Father Carlucci's previous assignments and the concerns that had been raised about his behavior, I could see their attitudes shift from wariness to genuine respect. "Father McCarthy," Detective Martinez said as they prepared to leave, "I want you to understand what you've just done. By providing us with this information voluntarily, you've potentially saved other children from being victimized. But you've also put yourself in a very difficult position with your own organization. Are you prepared for the consequences that are likely to follow?" I told her that I was as prepared as anyone could be for such consequences, though in truth I had no real understanding of how devastating those consequences would prove to be. Within 24 hours of my meeting with the police, Monsignor Hartley was on the phone, demanding an immediate explanation for my unauthorized contact with law enforcement. When I explained that I had decided I could no longer be complicit in covering up crimes against children, his response was swift and brutal. I was ordered to report to the diocesan offices immediately for an emergency meeting with Bishop Edmund Sullivan himself. Bishop Sullivan was a man I had admired and respected for many years. He had ordained me to the priesthood back in 1978, and I had always considered him to be a shepherd who truly cared about his flock. But the man who sat across from me in his office that afternoon was someone I barely recognized. His face was flushed with anger, and his voice shook with rage as he accused me of betraying everything that the priesthood represented. He told me that my actions had damaged not only my own reputation, but the reputation of every priest in the diocese. He said that I had violated my vows of obedience and had shown contempt for the authority that God had placed over me. "Father McCarthy," Bishop Sullivan said, his voice cold and threatening, "you have 24 hours to retract your statements to the police and to publicly apologize for the scandal you have caused. If you refuse, you will be suspended from all priestly functions immediately, and canonical proceedings will be initiated to have you removed from the priesthood permanently. Is that clear?" I looked at this man, who had once been my spiritual father, who had laid hands on me and welcomed me into the brotherhood of priests, and I realized that I was seeing him clearly for the first time in my life. He was not primarily concerned with justice for the children who had been abused, or with preventing future crimes, or with fulfilling the Church's moral obligations to protect the innocent. He was concerned with damage control, with protecting the institution's reputation and financial interests, and with maintaining the system of secrecy that allowed predators like Father Carlucci to operate with impunity. "Bishop Sullivan," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice, "I cannot and will not retract statements that are true. Children have been harmed, crimes have been committed, and our failure to report these crimes has made us accessories to those crimes. If standing up for the truth means losing my priesthood, then I accept that consequence. But I will not sacrifice innocent children on the altar of institutional reputation." The bishop's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and for a moment I thought he might actually strike me. Instead, he stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the street below. When he turned back to face me, his expression had changed from anger to something that looked almost like pity. "Father McCarthy," he said quietly, "you have no idea what you've done to yourself. When this is over, you will have no career, no pension, no community, no future. You will be completely alone. And for what? To satisfy some misguided sense of righteousness that will accomplish nothing except your own destruction." I left the diocesan offices that day knowing that my life as I had known it was over. The next morning, I found a formal letter of suspension on my desk, informing me that I was prohibited from celebrating Mass, hearing confessions, or performing any other priestly functions pending the outcome of canonical proceedings against me. The letter also informed me that I had 30 days to vacate the rectory at St. Margaret's and that my health insurance and other benefits would be terminated immediately. The weeks that followed were among the darkest of my entire life. The story of my cooperation with law enforcement broke in the local newspapers, and I became the target of intense criticism from many quarters. Conservative Catholic groups denounced me as a traitor who had betrayed his sacred vows. Some parishioners at St. Margaret's felt that I had damaged their parish's reputation and destroyed their trust in the priesthood. Even some victims' advocacy groups questioned my motives, suggesting that I was only trying to save myself after years of complicity in covering up abuse. Most painfully, many of my fellow priests turned their backs on me completely. Men who had been my friends and colleagues for decades stopped returning my phone calls and avoided me when we encountered each other in public. The priesthood is a small, tight-knit community, and when you are cast out of that community for violating its unwritten rules, the isolation is complete and devastating. I found myself not only without a job and a home, but without the social and spiritual support system that had sustained me for my entire adult life. But there were also unexpected sources of support that sustained me through those dark months. Jennifer Walsh remained in contact with me throughout the investigation and trial, offering encouragement and reminding me that my decision had given her hope that justice was possible. Several families whose children had been victimized by Father Carlucci reached out to thank me for finally taking their concerns seriously and for having the courage to act on their behalf. Some parishioners from St. Margaret's quietly expressed their support, even though they couldn't do so publicly without risking criticism from other church members. Most importantly, I began to receive letters and phone calls from other priests around the country who had faced similar situations and had remained silent to protect their careers and positions. These men told me about the guilt and spiritual anguish they carried from their own failures to speak out against abuse and corruption. Many of them said that my example had inspired them to re-examine their own complicity in systems of institutional protection for predators. Some even began to come forward with their own information about abuse cases that had been covered up in their dioceses. Father Carlucci was eventually convicted on multiple counts of child sexual abuse and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The trial revealed the full scope of his crimes, which included victims in 3 different parishes over a period of more than a decade. Several civil lawsuits were filed against the diocese, resulting in settlements that totaled millions of dollars. More importantly, the publicity surrounding the case led to changes in diocesan policies regarding the reporting of abuse allegations and the supervision of priests who worked with children. As for me, the canonical proceedings against me were eventually dropped, partly because of public pressure and partly because church officials realized that pursuing them would only generate more negative publicity. However, I was never reinstated to active ministry, and I was made to understand that no diocese would ever accept me as a priest again. At the age of 58, I found myself starting over with no career, no savings, and no clear idea of what the future would hold. But I also found myself with something I hadn't possessed in years, a clear conscience and a sense of spiritual integrity. For the first time since my ordination, I felt that I was truly living according to the gospel values that had originally called me to the priesthood. I had finally learned to distinguish between loyalty to God and loyalty to human institutions, between protecting the innocent and protecting the guilty, between speaking truth and maintaining comfortable lies. Today, at 73 years old, I work as a counselor at a non-profit organization that provides support services to survivors of institutional abuse. I help people who have been damaged by religious organizations, schools, youth programs, and other institutions that were supposed to protect them, but instead caused them harm. It's difficult work, both emotionally and financially, but it's the most meaningful work I've ever done. Every day, I have the opportunity to help people heal from trauma, to validate their experiences, and to support them in their journey toward recovery and wholeness. I want to close by speaking directly to anyone who might be listening to this story and facing their own moral crisis. Whether you're dealing with abuse in a religious organization, corruption in your workplace, injustice in your community, or any other situation where you're being pressured to remain silent about wrongdoing, I want you to know that speaking the truth is always worth the cost. Yes, there will be consequences. Yes, you may lose things that are important to you. Yes, the journey will be difficult and uncertain. But your integrity and your ability to live with yourself are more valuable than any career, any relationship, or any institutional position. If this story has touched you in any way, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and share your own thoughts in the comments below. I read every single comment, and I'm especially interested in hearing from those of you who have faced similar challenges or who are currently struggling with difficult moral decisions. Your stories matter, your courage matters, and your willingness to speak truth in the face of pressure and intimidation can make a difference in ways you may never fully understand. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply let others know that they are not alone in their struggles. Thank you for listening, thank you for caring, and thank you for having the courage to seek truth, even when it's uncomfortable or challenging. Together, we can create a world where protecting the innocent is more important than protecting institutions, where truth is valued more than reputation, and where moral courage is celebrated rather than punished.